Now, with all this technical material in place, we're in a position to go back to Anselm's ontological argument and try to reconstruct it as an argument with premises and a conclusion. And then we can ask, does it do the job we want? Is it a valid, sound argument that's potentially convincing to the reasonable agnostic? Let's start with the reconstruction. Let us now apply this apparatus to Anselm's argument, his ontological argument for the existence of God. Okay, the way we're going to reconstruct it here, the first premise of Anselm's argument, call it P1, is this. Either God exists in the understanding but not in reality, or God exists in the understanding and in reality. After all, Anselm said, even the fool understands what it is for there to be a God. The issue is whether the God really exists. Second premise of the argument. If God exists in the understanding but not in reality, then we can conceive of a thing greater than God, a thing different in virtue of existing in the understanding and in reality, but otherwise just like God. How much more awesome, extraordinary, great would God be if he existed in the understanding and in reality than if he just existed in the understanding? Premise 3. It is not the case that we can conceive of a thing greater than God. Remember, this was just part of the idea of God. This was not a controversial claim about the world. And some said this was just part of the idea of what it is to be God. It's to be a thing such that you can't be any better. Name a thing, call it God, and concede that it could be better, and you're not really talking about God. Conclusion. God exists in the understanding and in reality. Okay, so now, reconstructed this way, we have to look and see, is this argument good? And we have these tests that we've developed for goodness in an argument. First test, validity. Is the argument valid? Is it the case that it's possible that the premises be true and the conclusion false? If that's true, then it's invalid. If it's impossible that the premises be true and the conclusion false, then it's valid. Okay, looking at an argument like this, it's actually rather hard to tell immediately whether it's valid. After all, it's got lots of words in it. The words have got lots of clauses. There's lots of ands, lots of buts. It appears quite logically complicated. So to see whether an argument like this is valid, it's helpful to reduce it a bit, to simplify it, to look at its form. And we'll do this by replacing some of the clauses in the arguments with schematic letters. You'll see what I mean as we go along. So, first, take this phrase, God exists in the understanding but not in reality. Let's just put the letter X in place of that phrase. The argument now looks like this. Now take the phrase, God exists in the understanding and in reality. That occurs twice in the argument. Let's put the letter Y in place of that phrase. The argument now looks like this. Finally, let's take the phrase, we can conceive of a thing greater than God. That too occurs twice in the argument. We can replace it with the letter Z. And the argument looks like this. Still a bit jumbled, compress it, and we have an argument like this. Premise 1, either X or Y. Premise 2, if X, then Z. Premise 3, it's not the case that Z. Conclusion, Y. Is that a valid argument? Is it possible that the premises be true and the conclusion false? It isn't a valid argument. It is impossible that the premises be true and the conclusion false. Any argument with this form is valid. Why is that? Well, you can kind of see just by looking at premise 3. Premise 3 says it's not the case that Z. Now look at premise 2. Premise 2 says if X, then Z. Because it's not the case that Z, and if X, then Z, it must be not the case that X. Now look at premise 1. Premise 1 says either X or Y. If either X or Y, and it's not the case that X, then it must be that Y. But that's what the conclusion says. It's Y. So it's impossible that the premises be true and the conclusion false. So, well done, Anselm. His argument passes our first test. What about the remaining two? Soundness and, most importantly, potential convincingness to the reasonable agnostic. Well, here is where things get a bit hairy for Anselm. To really evaluate whether or not the argument is sound and convincing to the reasonable agnostic, we need to look at these premises and understand what on earth they mean. There's some very strange phrases in here. Most notably, God exists in the understanding but not in reality. What is it to exist in the understanding but not in reality? I mean, existing in the understanding, that's a very strange phrase, not one that we ordinarily use in everyday life. So, there are different ways to interpret this. Here's one way of understanding what this means. So, to say God exists in the understanding but not in reality is to say we can conceive of or imagine God existing, but he doesn't exist. Interpreted that way, the argument comes out like this. I'll read it. Premise 1. Either we can conceive of God existing but he doesn't exist, or we can conceive of God existing and he does exist. Premise 2. If we can conceive of God existing but he doesn't exist, then we can conceive of a thing greater than him, a thing just like him, but existing. Premise 3. It's not the case that we can conceive of a thing greater than God. Conclusion. We can conceive of God existing and he does exist. Okay. Put like that, how good is the argument? Well, look at premise 1. That looks pretty good. Either we can conceive of God existing but he doesn't exist, or we can conceive of God existing and he does exist. So long as we can conceive of God existing, premise 1 is going to be true. The problem comes with premise 2. Premise 2 on this interpretation looks kind of senseless, or if senseful, false. If we can conceive of God existing but he doesn't exist, then we can conceive of a thing greater than him, a thing just like him but existing. That just makes no sense. If we can conceive of him existing but he doesn't exist, then we can't do something further, namely conceive of him existing. When you conceive of him existing, there's nothing further you can do to conceive of him existing. You're already doing that. So premise 2 just comes out as manifestly false. And so certainly the argument is unsound and certainly not persuasive to the reasonable agnostic. So, is there another way of interpreting that key phrase, God exists in the understanding but not in reality? Well, here's something probably closer to what St. Anselm had in mind. What the phrase means is this. There's a God, and he has the property of existing in the understanding, but he lacks the property of existing in reality. Understood that second way, the argument comes out like this. Either there's a God with the property of existing in the understanding but lacking the property of existing in reality, or there's a God with both properties. If there is a God with the property of existing in the understanding but lacking the property of existing in reality, then we can conceive of a thing greater than him, a thing with the property of existing in reality, but otherwise just like him. Premise 3, it's not the case that we can conceive of a thing greater than God. Conclusion, there is a God with the property of existing in the understanding and, crucially, the property of existing in reality. Fine, but now look at that first premise. Is that something that the reasonable agnostic, somebody who is suspending judgment concerning the existence of God, will accept? Well, remember that the reasonable agnostic supposes that God might not exist. For the reasonable agnostic, that's a live possibility, as well as the possibility that God does exist. Suppose that God doesn't exist. Will the reasonable agnostic then accept that there's a God with the property of existing in the understanding? He might think not. The reasonable agnostic might say, no, in supposing that God doesn't exist, I don't suppose there is a God with a funny property existing in the understanding. In supposing that God doesn't exist, I suppose there isn't a God. So, on this interpretation, the reasonable agnostic is going to reject the first premise, or at least not accept the first premise of the argument. Let's go into that in a little bit more detail. Here's an example of something that the reasonable agnostic might suppose. He might suppose that God doesn't have a beginning or end. What does that mean? Well, maybe for the reasonable agnostic, supposing that God doesn't have a beginning or end does involve supposing that there's a thing, God, with a particular feature, not having a beginning or end. The reasonable agnostic might further suppose that, say, God doesn't like evil. And that might involve supposing that there's a thing, God, with a particular feature, not liking evil, But when the reasonable agnostic supposes that God does not exist, that does not involve supposing that there's a thing, God, with that particular feature, non-existence. Various philosophers over the course of history have made this point. David Hume in the 18th century, Immanuel Kant also in the 18th century, Russell in the 20th century. Existence is not a property. When we say a thing exists, and most pertinently when we say a thing doesn't exist, we don't suppose that there is the thing and that it has this funny property, not existing. As Russell put it, to say that would be to think that there was some difference between existing and being. Where does this leave us with the ontological argument? Well, it leaves us with an argument that works. Well, the argument doesn't work, but appears to work in virtue of what philosophers call an equivocation. There's different ways of understanding this phrase, God exists in the understanding but not in reality. On one way of understanding the phrase, the first premise of the argument looks fine and looks like the kind of thing that a reasonable agnostic is going to accept. But the second premise is bad. On the other way of understanding the argument, the second premise looks fine, the kind of thing that a reasonable agnostic might accept. But the first premise is bad. So, insofar as the argument might appear convincing, it's because each premise, when assessed independently, has a reading that appears plausible. But when one reading is given to all the premises, there's one way of interpreting the words in all the premises, then the argument comes out either unsound or unconvincing. So, what do we say back to St. Anselm all those years ago? Was he just lumbering around, making a basic error, confused, silly? Well, that would be premature. For a couple of reasons. Firstly, this was just one interpretation of the ontological argument that I've given. Anselm's words support many different interpretations. Maybe you can have a go at trying to reconstruct a better argument in premise and conclusion form. See if you can revive the ontological argument. Plenty of philosophers since have thought that they could. And the second reason to think that he was not just blundering around, foolish, making an elementary error, is that he was pointing to something that philosophers and people who think hard about the meanings of words today still find interesting and kind of mysterious. When I say a phrase like, the tooth fairy does not exist, I say of something that it doesn't exist. What do I mean? We'd better not mean this. There's a thing, the tooth fairy, with a feature not existing. But if I don't mean that, what do I mean? What is it to say of the tooth fairy that the tooth fairy doesn't exist, if not to say of a thing, the tooth fairy, that it has a feature not existing? This is something that philosophers of language, people who think about the meanings of words, still think about and are slightly puzzled by and still have different theories about even today. And so he was, at the very least, pointing to an issue that is of continuing interest. That's Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. Looks like it's mistaken. Looks like it doesn't do the job we want done. Perhaps you can do a better job of reconstructing it. Based on Anselm's words, perhaps you can make an effort to come up with a better argument for the existence of God. I encourage you to give it a shot. Meanwhile, we're going to move on. Next time, we're going to look at some more influential to contemporary people arguments for the existence of God, having to do with design. Basic idea, the world around us shows evidence of having been made. And where there's making, there's a maker.